A grieving widower, Daniel Carver, thought his life had ended, until a shivering 10-year-old appeared at his door clutching a letter from his late wife. The truth behind her arrival revealed a hidden family bond long kept secret, and the silence of those lost years felt almost like a betrayal. But Emily's final words carried a request Daniel could neither ignore nor run from, and they set in motion a choice that would change them both. Just wait until you hear the moving turn this story took, and how it ended with a quiet but undeniable victory for the heart. The evening air in the Montana mountains carried the kind of stillness that could make a man feel both safe and unbearably alone. Snow, fine and dry, whispered against the cabin's windows, and the scent of burning pine logs filled the single room. Daniel Carver sat in his worn leather chair by the fireplace, a book unopened on his lap. Reading had become less about stories and more about distracting his thoughts, but tonight even that felt pointless. The past 3 years had folded into one long stretch of days that looked the same. The rhythm of chopping wood, boiling coffee, fixing whatever the cold broke, all to keep him from thinking too long about the life he used to have, about her, Emily. She had been the one bright thread in his world, the reason this cabin had once been more than just wood and nails. Her laughter had filled these walls, turning the remote silence into something warm. But 3 winters ago, she was taken from him in a sudden accident on an icy road. Since then, Daniel had kept the world at arm's length. He avoided town except for supply runs, spoke to no one longer than a few minutes, and carried his solitude like armor. No one came up this way unless they were lost, and in his mind that was how it should stay. So when a knock came at the door, sharp and deliberate against the wood, it didn't just surprise him. It unsettled him. He froze for a moment, head tilted toward the sound, wondering if it was the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, softer this time, almost hesitant. He rose slowly, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and crossed the small space to the door. Pulling it open, he found himself staring at a figure far smaller than he'd expected, a girl maybe 10 years old. She stood on the porch in a threadbare coat several sizes too big, the fabric frayed at the cuffs. Her sneakers, once white, were now the color of dust and caked with half-melted snow. Strands of hair clung to her cold-reddened cheeks, and her breath rose in quick, uneven clouds. But what caught Daniel's attention wasn't her clothing or the way she shivered. It was what she held. Pressed tightly to her chest was a single envelope, the paper worn and slightly bent at the corners, as if it had traveled far and been handled too many times. In faded ink, he saw the handwriting that punched the air from his lungs. For Daniel Carver, from Emily. For a moment he could only stare at it. The name was his, but the words from Emily felt like something from a different lifetime. His voice, when it came, sounded strange to his own ears. Low, guarded, almost hoarse. "Who are you?" The girl swallowed, her eyes flicking up to meet his. They were gray, the pale, shifting kind of gray that reminded him of dawn fog curling over a frozen lake. She clutched the envelope even tighter, as though afraid the wind might take it from her. "My name's Lily," she said, and her voice trembled in a way that wasn't just from the cold. "My mom. She told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should find you and give you this letter." Daniel's chest tightened, not only at her words, but at the way she forced herself to stand there, holding herself steady against the fear in her face. He could see it. The raw, uncertain edge in her eyes. It wasn't the kind of fear that came from meeting a stranger in the woods. It was deeper, heavier, the kind of fear born when a child knows she is alone in the world and doesn't yet understand what that means. And as he stood in the doorway, the snow drifting between them, Daniel realized the truth he'd been avoiding since the knock first sounded. He wasn't just looking at a lost child on his porch. He was looking at his past, a past he had tried to bury in silence and distance, standing there, breathing in the cold, and waiting for him to decide whether he would open the door wider or let it close again. Lily spoke quietly at first, as though unsure if she was even allowed to tell her story. Her voice trembled in the pauses, and Daniel could see she was choosing her words with care, the way someone does when every memory feels fragile. She told him her mother had passed away just a month ago, taken by an illness that had lingered for years. There was no sudden moment, no shocking event, just a slow fading that she had been forced to watch. Her father, she said without hesitation or bitterness, had left before she was even born, It was always just the two of them, moving through life like a small boat on a vast, unpredictable sea. They had lived in a little town far from here, a place Daniel had never visited, nestled between long stretches of farmland and one narrow road that seemed to lead nowhere. Lily described a small apartment above a store, the way the floor creaked when you walked to the kitchen, the peeling paint on the windowsill, where she'd sit to watch people go by. She spoke of her mother's gentle laugh, even in the hard moments, and how she always found ways to make things seem less heavy than they were. It was only in the final days, when her voice was weak and her eyes clouded with the weight of time running out, that she told Lily the truth, that Emily Carver, Daniel's wife, was her older sister. The words hit Daniel like a stone dropped into still water. He stood motionless, the silence between them thick enough to feel. Emily had never mentioned having a sister. She had sometimes disappeared for a week or two, calling it taking care of things or visiting someone who needed her. But she'd always returned with that same warm smile, carrying whatever secret she had tucked away. He had assumed it was old friends, maybe distant relatives she didn't want to discuss. Now all those unexplained trips stitched themselves into a different pattern. Lily, he realized with a tightness in his chest, was his niece. Not some stranger's child left at his door, but blood, the last living piece of Emily's family. His hands felt suddenly clumsy as he reached for the envelope she still held. She passed it to him without a word, and when he turned it over in his palm, his breath caught. The paper was worn smooth at the edges, the flaps sealed but faintly loosened from being carried for so long. The handwriting across the front was unmistakable. He broke the seal with slow care, as though opening it too quickly might erase the words inside. The first line struck deep. "Dan, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone." Her voice was in every curve of the letters. He could almost hear her speaking the words, soft and steady, just as she always did when she needed him to truly listen. The letter continued. "Lily is my daughter, and your family. You are the only one I trust with her future. Please don't turn her away. I know you're afraid to love someone again, but she is your chance to survive." Daniel stopped reading for a moment, his hand tightening around the page. It wasn't just the request that shook him. It was how precisely Emily had seen through him, even from beyond the years they'd shared. She knew the wall he had built around his heart since losing her. She knew the fear that had kept him locked in this cabin, the fear that if he let someone in again, life would find a way to take them from him too. Inside him, a storm was gathering. He had learned to keep his emotions buried, letting grief harden into something unmovable. But now it was cracking. The letter was a key turning in a lock he had not wanted opened. The memories of Emily's smile, her stubborn kindness, the way she would always push him to be braver than he believed himself to be, they all rose to the surface. When he looked at Lily again, he noticed something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. Behind the worry and exhaustion on her face was the same determined spark he had seen in Emily countless times. The way her chin lifted slightly when she was scared but unwilling to show it. The same quiet resilience that had made him fall in love all those years ago. He realized in that moment that sending her away, placing her in the care of strangers, would be more than a refusal. It would be a betrayal. Not only of Lily, who had come all this way to find him, but of Emily's memory. To turn her away would mean closing the door on the last promise he could keep to the woman he had loved more than anything. Daniel folded the letter with deliberate care, placing it back into the envelope. He could feel Lily's gaze on him, searching for an answer in his expression. And though the fear was still there, the fear of failing her, of losing again, it was met now with something stronger, a pull deep inside, quiet but undeniable, telling him that maybe Emily had been right, maybe this was his chance to survive. By the third morning, the rhythm of the cabin had subtly changed. Daniel noticed it first in the small sounds, the shuffle of lighter footsteps across the wooden floorboards, the faint clinking of mismatched dishes being set out, the muffled hum of a child speaking to herself while she worked. Lily was no longer sitting quietly in a corner, unsure if she belonged. She was moving through the space as though testing how it might feel to call it her own. Outside, the air was sharp and crisp, the kind of cold that made every breath rise in visible ribbons. Daniel was splitting logs in the clearing beside the cabin when Lily appeared at his side, sleeves rolled up past her wrists despite the chill. Without a word, she picked up a smaller axe from where it leaned against the woodpile. Her first few swings were clumsy, the blade glancing off at awkward angles, but she didn't complain. Each time the wood resisted, she squared her shoulders and tried again, cheeks flushed pink from the effort. Daniel caught himself watching her with a quiet sense of recognition, the same stubborn persistence that Emily had carried into everything she did. When they moved back inside, the warmth from the old cast-iron stove wrapped around them. Lily insisted on trying to cook, standing on her toes to reach the counter. She fumbled with the heavy kettle and asked where the sugar was kept, her brow furrowing in concentration. The smell of slightly over-toasted bread filled the air, and though it wasn't perfect, Daniel didn't correct her. It had been years since the cabin's kitchen had carried the sound of someone else's hands at work, and the imperfection felt oddly comforting. Throughout the day, Lily's curiosity roamed freely. She traced her fingers over the carved patterns on the back of the rocking chair, opened drawers to peek inside, and studied the old hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace with a kind of cautious respect. But most of all, she asked questions about Emily. What was she like when you first met? Did she ever get scared living all the way out here? What was her favorite thing to do in winter? At first, Daniel's answers were short, almost reluctant. He wasn't used to saying Emily's name out loud anymore. It carried a weight that always seemed to catch in his throat. But the more Lily asked, the easier it became to picture her. Not as a memory locked away, but as a living presence in the stories. He told her about Emily's quick wit, how she could outmatch him in an argument without raising her voice, and how she had a way of making even the most ordinary day feel like part of a larger adventure. And then, without realizing it, he found himself speaking of the harder times too. The long winters when supplies ran low, the repairs that tested their patience, the moments they doubted themselves but leaned on each other anyway. That evening after dinner, the two of them sat at the small table with a worn photo album open between them. The lamplight cast a warm glow over the pages, highlighting images that had begun to fade at the edges. Lily leaned close, her hair brushing the back of Daniel's hand as she turned each page with care. She stopped at a picture of Emily standing by the lake, hair windblown, smiling as though the moment itself belonged only to her. There was a pause before Lily spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Uncle Dan, are you happy that I came here?" The question lingered in the air. Daniel's eyes stayed on the photograph, the memory behind it swelling in his chest. Just a week ago, he would have answered without hesitation, not out of honesty, but because he believed the truth was simple. Back then, he thought his life had reached its final shape. The loss he carried felt permanent, like a shadow that couldn't be lifted. But now, sitting beside Lily, he could feel something shifting. The pain was still there, deep, unyielding, but alongside it had grown a quieter presence, something warmer, a sense that his existence no longer served only himself. He looked at her then, really looked. She was watching him with a kind of openness that was rare in the world, a hope that hadn't yet learned to guard itself. In her expression, he saw not only the echo of Emily's smile, but also the possibility of something new, something that might yet be worth building. "Yes, Lily," he said at last, his voice low but certain. "I think this might be the best thing that could have happened." The faintest smile touched her lips, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt that the cabin, once filled only with silence and the weight of memory, had begun to breathe. Again, winter in Montana did not forgive carelessness. The winds carried a cutting edge, the snow piled high against the cabin walls, and the days shrank to brief hours of pale sunlight. Yet Daniel and Lily found their own way through it, building a life that was both demanding and strangely full. In the early mornings, he showed her how to string a bow, how to steady her breathing before letting the arrow fly. She listened intently, squinting against the glare off the snow, determined to match his example. On other days, they set small traps in the woods, marking the paths with discreet signs only the two of them recognized. Clearing snow from the roof became a shared task, Lily hauling the lighter shovelfuls and laughing when the wind stole the flakes into swirling clouds. But it wasn't only the work that changed Daniel. Lily carried a kind of lightness he had almost forgotten existed. She teased him over the way he took his coffee, challenged him to checkers by the fire, and sometimes stubbornly argued with him about things that didn't matter. What counted as the best kind of soup, whether wolves or mountain lions were the more impressive hunters. These small, ordinary disagreements, filled with mock indignation and easy laughter, began to loosen something inside him. And in the quiet moments when she spoke about what she wanted to be when she grew up, or what kind of dog they should get one day, he found himself thinking about a future again, a thought he had avoided for years. By the time the snow receded and the rivers began to rush with meltwater, Daniel knew he couldn't keep the arrangement informal. The decision was clear. So one bright morning in early spring, they rode into the nearest town. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and polish, its high windows letting in beams of sunlight that fell across the rows of wooden benches. When their turn came, they stood before a judge whose tone was firm but not unkind. She reviewed the documents, asked Lily a few questions about living in the cabin, and then turned her attention to Daniel. "Are you certain about this?" she asked, studying him over the rim of her glasses. Daniel looked at Lily. She stood straight, hands clasped in front of her, watching him with quiet expectation. In that moment, there was no hesitation left in him. "Yes," he said clearly, "she is my family." The judge gave a small nod and signed the papers. It was a simple gesture, but Daniel felt as though something weighty had settled into place. Not a burden, but an anchor. On the drive back, the mountain road winding beneath the first buds of green, Lily reached into the inside pocket of her worn backpack. "Mom told me to give you this," she said, her voice softer now, "but only when you decided to stay with me." She handed him a small envelope, creased at the edges from being kept so close for so long. Daniel opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph, one he didn't remember being taken. He was there in the hospital room, his arm around Emily, who was smiling down at the tiny bundle in her arms. Lily, barely a day old, was swaddled in a pale blanket, her face turned slightly toward the camera. On the back, in Emily's handwriting, were just 3 words: "You are home." Daniel felt the breath leave him in a long, quiet exhale. He looked over at Lily, who was watching him, unsure of his reaction. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. The ache he had carried for so long, the hollow, unyielding weight of losing Emily, didn't vanish. But for the first time, it loosened. The sharp edges softened, replaced by a warmth that came from knowing he wasn't alone anymore. He had lost his wife, and that loss would always be part of him. But in its place, something new had taken root. A reason to rise each morning, to plan for the next season, to share the small victories of each day. In Lily's presence, he found not just a connection to Emily, but a purpose that stretched beyond grief. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe that the life ahead could be more than survival. It could be lived.